It's the second largest country on Earth, bigger than China, bigger than the entire European Union combined. But for most of its history, almost nobody lived there. Just ice. Miles of it. 20,000 years ago, Canada didn't exist. A wall of ice up to 3 kilometers thick covered nearly the entire landmass. The Laurentide ice sheet was so massive, it pressed the Earth's crust downward.
It locked up so much water that global sea levels dropped over 100 meters. Land bridges appeared where oceans should have been. And across one of those bridges, the first humans walked into North America.
They came in waves over thousands of years. Some followed coastlines in primitive boats. Others tracked mammoth herds across frozen tundra. As the ice retreated, these early peoples spread south and east across the entire continent. Over millennia, the ice melted. Rivers carved new paths. Forests reclaimed the land. And the people who had followed the retreating glaciers built civilizations that would thrive for over 12,000 years before any European set foot here. The Haida carved massive cedar totems on the Pacific coast. Their art and seafaring skills rivaled anything in the ancient world. These weren't primitive wanderers. They were civilizations with trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers. The Haudenosaunee built one of the most sophisticated democratic governance systems on the continent. The Inuit engineered survival in Arctic conditions that would kill most humans within hours. 12,000 years of civilization. Then the sails appeared. But every trade route, every tradition, every spiritual connection to the land was about to collide with a force these civilizations had never imagined. A force arriving from across the Atlantic Ocean. The first Europeans to reach Canada were likely the Vikings. Around 1000 CE, Norse explorers under Leif Erikson crossed the North Atlantic and established a small settlement in Newfoundland. They called the land Vinland. It didn't last. Within a few years, conflicts with indigenous peoples and brutal conditions drove them away. 500 years of silence followed. Then, Europe returned, and this time, it stayed. In 1497, John Cabot, sailing for England, reached Newfoundland's coast and claimed it for the English crown. But he found something even more valuable than land. Something that would change everything. Codfish. The Grand Banks teemed with so many cod that sailors reportedly scooped them from the sea in baskets. Within decades, European fishing fleets were crossing the Atlantic every summer to harvest this underwater gold. But it was France that pushed inland first. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River and claimed the territory for France. The word Canada itself likely comes from the Iroquoian word Kanata, meaning village. A misheard word became a nation's name. Cartier claimed a territory he didn't understand for a king who had never seen it, from peoples who had no concept of land being owned. By the early 1600s, Samuel de Champlain established Quebec City, the first permanent French settlement. But France wasn't interested in mass colonization. It was interested in something far more specific: fur. European fashion demanded beaver felt hats. The demand was insatiable, and Canada had more beavers than anywhere on Earth. The fur trade didn't just build an economy, it built alliances that shaped the continent for centuries. Across the Atlantic, a single beaver hat sold for a fortune on London and Paris streets. Fashioned thousands of miles away, was driving the destruction of Canadian wilderness. But partnership with Indigenous nations came with a cost nobody anticipated. European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, struck communities with no immunity. Epidemics killed 50 to 90% of entire populations. Nations collapsed within a single generation. It was one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. Most of this devastation happened before any battles were fought. Diseases raced ahead of the colonizers themselves, emptying entire regions. By the time European settlers arrived in force, they found lands they described as empty, lands that had been full just decades earlier. Meanwhile, France and England's global rivalry exploded in North America. The 7 Years' War would decide who controlled Canada forever, and the decisive moment came on a single night at the base of an impossible cliff. Meanwhile, France and England's global rivalry exploded in North America. The 7 Years' War would decide who controlled Canada forever, and the decisive moment came on a single night at the base of an impossible cliff. The battle lasted less than 30 minutes. It was ferocious and decisive. Both commanding generals, Wolfe and French General Montcalm, were fatally wounded. 30 minutes, and the entire future of a continent was decided. The Treaty of Paris gave Britain control of virtually all French territory in North America. New France ceased to exist with the stroke of a pen. But its people, hundreds of thousands of French-speaking Canadians, didn't disappear. They remained. They kept their language, their Catholic faith, their civil law, their culture, creating a linguistic and cultural duality that would define Canada forever. French and English, side by side, never quite merging. Then, the American Revolution changed everything again. 60,000 loyalists, colonists faithful to the British Crown, flooded northward into Canada. America's revolution didn't just create the United States, it helped create Canada as the place that chose not to rebel. By the mid-1800s, British North America was a collection of separate colonies that had almost nothing in common. The distances were staggering. 5,000 kilometers of forest, rock, and wilderness, with no roads and no railways connecting them. The Hudson's Bay Company, a fur trading corporation, technically owned a landmass larger than all of Europe. A single company controlled more territory than most empires in history. Commerce came before country. The United States had just finished its Civil War with 1 million battle-hardened soldiers and a philosophy called Manifest Destiny, continental domination. British colonies genuinely feared being absorbed. Something had to be done. Fast. The fathers of Confederation gathered, politicians from separate colonies who could barely agree on anything. Maritime delegates looked to the sea. Quebec guarded its French identity fiercely. Ontario wanted Western expansion. Somehow, they had to find common ground. On July 1, 1867, the British North America Act created the Dominion of Canada. 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. Not full independence yet, but self-governance on a scale these colonies had never experienced. But the new nation's most ambitious and dangerous project was still ahead: a transcontinental railroad to stitch the impossibly vast country together. British Columbia joined on one condition: connect us by rail within 10 years. The Canadian Pacific Railway, the most ambitious infrastructure project the young nation had ever attempted. The Canadian Shield alone was a nightmare: ancient Precambrian rock, endless swamps, and dense forest that consumed men and money relentlessly.
Dynamite and pickaxes versus rock that was over 1 billion years old. Progress was measured in feet per day. Hundreds of workers died from blasting accidents, rockfalls, disease, and the brutal Canadian winters.
Over 15,000 Chinese workers were brought in, paid a fraction of white workers' wages, and given the most dangerous jobs: tunnel blasting, cliff face drilling. Hundreds died from explosions, landslides, and freezing cold. Their sacrifice was erased from history for decades. On November 7, 1885, the last spike was driven at Craigellachie, British Columbia. Canada finally had a physical iron connection stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. A nation stitched together by rail. But the railway enabled dark chapters too: rapid prairie colonization, displacement of indigenous nations from their ancestral territories, deliberate destruction of the bison herds, and the beginning of something even worse. The residential school system forcibly removed Indigenous children from their families for over a century. Stripped of language, stripped of culture, thousands never came home. It was cultural genocide, and Canada hid it for generations. 38. Canada entered World War I still unsure of its own identity. At Vimy Ridge, all 4 Canadian divisions fought together for the first time and captured a position that French and British forces had failed to take. Over 66,000 Canadians died in World War I. From a population of under 8 million, it was devastating. But Vimy Ridge is often called the moment Canada truly became a nation, not just on paper, but in blood and spirit. World War II cemented Canada on the world stage. Canadian forces stormed Juno Beach on D-Day, liberated the Netherlands, and fought across Italy and Northwest Europe, a nation that punched far above its weight. The liberation of the Netherlands forged a bond between Canada and Holland that endures to this day. Every year, the Dutch send thousands of tulip bulbs to Ottawa, a living thank you that has never stopped. After the war, waves of immigrants transformed Canada. Italians, Ukrainians, Greeks, Poles. Hundreds of thousands arrived seeking new lives. The country that had been overwhelmingly British and French was becoming something entirely new. Universal health care became law, the idea that no Canadian should go bankrupt because they got sick. It became perhaps the most defining value of Canadian identity. Care as a right, not a privilege. Official bilingualism enshrined both English and French as equal national languages. 2 founding cultures, 1 country. It was the compromise that held Canada together, and it remains the defining tension to this day. In 1982, Pierre Trudeau brought the Constitution home. Canada finally had its own Charter of Rights and Freedoms, full sovereignty, no longer requiring British parliamentary approval. The colonial chapter was formally, finally, closed.
Canada became the first country on Earth to adopt multiculturalism as official government policy. Immigration transformed the nation into one of the most ethnically diverse countries on the planet. Diversity wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated as national identity. Today, Canada is one of the most prosperous nations on Earth. Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, cities that consistently rank among the world's most livable. A frozen wasteland that became a global destination.
But Canada's greatest failure demanded a reckoning. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission documented the horrors of residential schools. Thousands of unmarked graves were discovered. An apology was given, but healing takes far longer than words.
The complete history of Canada is not a story of conquest or empire. It's a story of negotiation, sometimes brilliant, often deeply flawed. A country forged between 2 oceans by people who had nothing in common except geography.
Canada's greatest strength has always been its willingness to evolve. Its greatest failure, how long it took to acknowledge who paid the price. The story isn't over. It never is. And that might be the most Canadian thing